Welcome and thank you so much for joining us this evening or afternoon or night, depending on your time zone. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce myself before delving into the scope of this panel. My name is Viral Popescu. I'm a senior lecturer and the director of the Masters of Science in Biodiversity Data Analytics program at Columbia University. This program is a partnership between the School of Professional Studies and the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology at Columbia, where I'm also a research scientist. I'm a conservation biologist with more than 15 years of experience in conducting applied quantitative wildlife and biodiversity research that is addressing some of the most pressing issues for biodiversity loss, such as overexploitation, habitat loss, climate change, and how those shape the future of animal populations worldwide. So why are we here this evening? Over the past few years, biodiversity has truly moved from the margins of sustainability conversations into the center of decision-making in finance, policy, businesses, and frameworks like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures or the European Union Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive are now asking companies, investors, businesses to quantify their impact and dependencies on nature, often with the same confidence and accuracy that we expect for financial and climate data. So this broadens the scope and the burden of addressing biodiversity loss from governments and NGOs to all sectors of the economy. But biodiversity is different, right? It is inherently local, it's contextual, and it's hard to reduce to a single metric. And while technological advances have dramatically improved our ability to collect and analyze biodiversity data, sorry, the real challenge now is translating that data into information that actually changes decisions, whether those are made in the boardroom, in ministries, conservation field sites, local communities. So this is why we're meeting today. We're here to talk about how biodiversity data can be harnessed, not just for reporting or compliance, but for better, credible decisions across many sectors, including investment and conservation. And we'll explore where current approaches are working, where they're falling short, and how do we avoid turning nature into another box-checking exercise or even worse, a greenwashing narrative? And this conversation is closely tied to these new training pathways that we are developing and are emerging, including the launch of this new master's program in Biodiversity Data Analytics. The demand is no longer just for data or models, but for people who can bridge many fields like ecology, data science, decision-making with their own expertise like sustainability and finance, auditing. So it's people that understand both the limits of the data and the consequences of how it's used. So the question for this panel tonight isn't whether the data or nature data, biodiversity data, and AI will shape decisions. They already are. The question is whether they'll do so in a way that is scientifically defensible, that is relevant for decisions and capable of delivering real outcomes for people and for nature. And with that, I'm very excited to welcome our panelists, Dr. Carly Batiste, a Nature Tech and Innovation Manager at Conservation International, a large NGO with global reach, and Gillian Malad, Senior Principal Product Manager at Intercontinental Exchange, a multinational financial services company. And I'd like to jump in the first topic for tonight's panel and ask our panelists to introduce themselves, their background, their role in their organization before delving into the topics. So I would like to start with the big picture, the climate-nature nexus, with a question for both of you. Like I mentioned earlier, nature shows up everywhere when we talk about climate adaptation, resilience, carbon accounting, as something that needs to be integrated or accounted for, but biodiversity, it's a bit more difficult to quantify than carbon, water, or forests. So the question really is, how can biodiversity data and AI tools can be used to support sustainable, resilient outcomes, rather than becoming a convenient narrative layer on top of climate action? So how do we bring nature and biodiversity on equal footing with climate and carbon? So Gillian or
Should I get started?
the floor? Sure.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Gillian Malad. And so my background is in environmental science and geospatial analysis. I actually have dual Columbia degrees. So I did my undergraduate at Barnard, and I did my graduate degree at Columbia. But when I studied at Barnard, um, I studied environmental science, and I was always very interested in biodiversity and climate change and climate policy. And then after I graduated, I thought I was going to go right back to school, but I ended up working for a land conservation organization. So I spent the first 13 years of my career in the land conservation field, working predominantly on geospatial analysis. So I really got into geospatial analysis after school when I was, working. Um, and then at some point, I decided I needed a career change, and I dovetailed into the financial sector, which was quite a surprise for me because I never expected when I was in conservation that I would end up in the financial sector. But I currently work for Intercontinental Exchange. Our acronym, unfortunately, at this time is ICE. But yeah, so at ICE, I work for the ICE climate team. ICE is a big financial service provider. We're best known for our exchange and commodity markets, and we own and run the New York Stock Exchange. But I work for a small team within ICE that sits within the sustainable finance, and that's our ICE climate team. And the two products that I work on are global physical risk solution and our nature and biodiversity solution. And as you might guess from those, they're very geospatial in nature. Most of what we do is, create asset level metrics for financial institutions. And, a lot of what I'm doing is stuff with nature. So I just want to quickly, you know, put a quick definitions on things. So nature really is any part of the natural world that is not man-made. And biodiversity is the diversity of life, which is everything from the molecular level to large mammals, includes plants, ecosystems, soils. And we need healthy ecosystems and a biodiverse planet to support all forms of life. And that includes human life. And I think we really experience firsthand how human encroachment on natural systems can go completely awry during the global pandemic. And in some ways, it's nature's way of saying, you mess with us and we'll mess with you. And I think that's really when we started to say, oh, well, we should start taking this more seriously. And it was right around the pandemic that the Task Force on Nature Financial Data um, was established. Um, and it was established to closely align with the TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And really, climate and nature are very interconnected. Um, Most of the ways that we will solve the climate crisis is through nature. But of course, climate change is accelerating, and we're seeing biodiversity loss as a result of climate change. Species are disappearing at an alarming rate. So really, we need to tackle both nature and climate together. So resilience to climate change involves healthy biodiverse ecosystems. And so understanding these systems and how they interact with each other and with humans is essential. So in the sector where I work, the goal is to understand the financial risks associated with biodiversity loss. And to give you an idea of what that looks like, if you're an agricultural company, you may be relying on pollinators, water, healthy soils, all of this to produce the food you sell. And so you're reliant on nature to generate revenue for your company. The other way that we see risk at companies is if you're, say, a mining company and you are impacting the biodiversity around you. So that would be like a more biodiversity negative impacts. So we help institutional investors understand the risks in their portfolio by identifying the companies who are the most reliant on nature or the most impactful to biodiversity. And that's what I
Okay.
have to say.
All right.
Pass it on
Thank
to
you,
Carly.
Julian. Yeah, got it. Thanks.
Yeah, hi everyone. Great to be here. Really excited to be having this conversation and see the rise of programs like this new master's at Columbia to really create the future workforce that's necessary in conservation. My name is Carly, and as Beryl mentioned, I'm at Conservation International. I'm on the Nature Tech and Innovation team. So we I am an ecologist by background and sort of fell into technology accidentally, or so, yeah, sort of. But it that intersection of conservation and technology is one that I've been at for the majority of my professional career now. And it started with chasing lemurs in Madagascar and then wanting to not chase lemurs as much. So using passive acoustic monitoring as a way to remotely monitor lemurs and using AI models to pick out the lemur calls out of these sound recordings. So that was how I got my start at that intersection. And now at CI, we support the organization in sort of figuring out what sorts of biodiversity monitoring, nature tech, data they need for different types of projects. And then we also have projects that are sort of run and owned by our team that are experiments and pilots of how particular technologies or AI tools can work for different conservation use cases. So Conservation International is a large environmental conservation nonprofit. Our headquarters are here in DC, but we have 30 country offices across the global South. We work in over 100 countries, and it really runs the gamut of conservation. So we have policy teams that work with governments. We have corporate relations folks who work with corporates and sustainable supply chains. We have oceans teams that work on coastal resilience and marine protected areas, restoration. And so it is a really wide range of use cases, each of which comes with its own unique challenges and constraints and happening across ecosystems and across countries. So figuring out how we get the data we need to be able to support the nature positive action that we're working towards is incredibly crucial and drives all of our decision making as an organization to make sure that we're prioritizing resources appropriately and really showing quantitatively and scientifically in a rigorous way that we are having the outcomes that we say and driving nature for people. Because as Jillian mentioned, we need nature. It is the food that we eat, the water we drink, the clothes we wear, the houses we live in, right? It is fundamental to our human existence. And so it is incredibly important to be able to understand the impacts that we have on nature, the dependencies that we have, and how we can mitigate those impacts so that humans can live alongside the rest of this amazing natural world that gives us the life that we have. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
All right. Thank you both for this introduction. So we'll come back a little bit later about talking about climate and nature and the kind of the balance between the two. But I wanted to backtrack a little bit after thinking about this big picture and talk more about biodiversity data. I feel like it's become kind of another sustainable development. Everybody uses biodiversity data, or climate change, like a very kind of almost like a nebulous topic. So just like Gillian mentioned earlier, like the definition of biodiversity is broad and as broad as intimidating almost as they come, right? Is the variation of all living things, genes, population, species, ecosystems. So so this one's for Carly here. So when we're faced with this like insurmountable task of measuring what people say, we call like pretty much everything everywhere all at once. So what is biodiversity data that you're commonly using or usually using? How do we collect such data? And what are some of the key technological advances, including in the AI space, that are facilitating just biodiversity data acquisition and processing?
Yeah, it really is a huge range of tools that we have in our toolbox now that have advanced at a really rapid rate particularly in the last few decades. So we can look at this again from the genes to species to ecosystem level. With the sort of broader ecosystem level, it's a lot of remote sensing. So looking at things like satellite imagery or aerial vehicles like drones or low flying planes that we get imagery from. And that can help us understand ecosystem extent, different measures of ecosystem condition. With drones, where there's now models that are being tested to identify individual tree crowns and the species that they are. So really, a really wide array of monitoring that can be done sort of at the remote sensing level. For sort of more species level monitoring, it's typically more in situ, like on ground sensors, like camera traps, acoustic monitors, as I mentioned, so detecting both species that are vocal, and those sorts of on-ground sensors that help you understand what wildlife is in an area. At the genetic level, there are tools like environmental DNA. So the premise there is that animals and plants and everything sheds DNA as it kind of lives throughout within an ecosystem. And we can pick up on those traces of genetic material with water and soil samples and match that up with genome libraries and understand what species are in an area. So that helps us get even to the level of understanding what microscopic things are in an area or sort of other smaller things that we don't think about as much, like fungi and these sorts of important invertebrates and small critters. So there's different technologies that exist across kind of that spectrum of biodiversity, depending on really what the project goal is, right? You always want to be, you don't want to be just throwing tech at something, hoping it works. You want it to be problem based and work backwards as to what data you need for your project, what tech can get you that data, that sort of thing. So it's come a long way in terms of the data collection process because sensors used to be massive, right? In the 1950s, there were people who were carrying around horse-drawn wagons that had sound recorders on them that were like the size of a bathtub. And we no longer have to do that, thankfully, because now the acoustic sensors I used were, this big and quite cheap, and $100 or so. So because the sensors have gotten cheaper, smaller, more accessible, we're now able to get like a ridiculous amount of data. And that's really where AI and machine learning came in, because the bottleneck had shifted to that data analysis stage. So that's where a lot of the kind of analytical workflows for these different sensors are using AI for satellite imagery to detect ecosystem type or to detect events like wildfire or floods, from on-ground sensors using AI to automatically tell you what animal is in the camera trap images so that you're not just clicking through a bunch of images of a leaf blowing in the wind right in front of your camera. So AI has been embedded into all of that. And really now what I see as a critical next step is data fusion and the ability to integrate data from these different sensor technologies together to get really comprehensive insights.
Great. Thank you for addressing this question, including the AI question, which always like looms large about, okay, how do we, there was a very interesting question that was posed earlier about how do we, how do we use AI when we know that AI, has all these externalities, right? And I'm glad that you mentioned that lots of the AI tools that we're using, they're small models, they're not usually, ChatGPT type of things that are really having this very large externalities. But before we move into the next question, if Jillian, just wanted to ask you, just in your sector and industry, the types of data that are mostly commonly using, and after that we can move on to the next topic.
Yeah, so it's interesting because, Carly's talking about very like local based data, environmental monitoring, species intelligence. And what we're really doing more is we work at a global scale. So, we usually have to compromise a little bit when you model with a global scale because you lose some of the granularity of doing more local based analysis. But we really try to take information at the local scale and aggregate it to the global scale without losing any of the important details. And so one of the things that we do is, we use a lot of the data that Carly is talking about, but we aggregate it up. But we try to do it at not just like, it used to be. I started my career in the early 2000s, and it was at a time when 1 kilometer pixels were considered to be high resolution. Data wasn't updated that frequently, and satellite data was like cumbersome to work with. And really, we've seen remarkable changes in the last 20 years. But what I really work with is high resolution geospatial layers that are 30 kilometers, less than 1 kilometer is really what we're looking for.
Mhm.
Sorry, I said 30 kilometers, I meant 30 meters. Trying to stay, around the somewhere that's much less than 1 kilometer. And then what we do is we overlay corporate operations on top of that. So whether that's a mine, an agricultural field, or a building, and then understanding at that building site what's going on the ground, what is going on in that operations, and how big is the operations, right? Is it 10 employees or is it 300 employees? And then getting a sense of what the impact that operation is having on the land where it's located, um, or what reliance is that operations having on the nature that surrounds it. And so what we really try to do is take the insights at the asset level and then we aggregate it to the overall corporate, so that we can kind of get a sense of the risk associated with all the locations that company has. And we're also working to incorporate supply chain, which is a little bit of a gray
Mhm.
area, and that's sort of still in the works. No one's doing a fantastic job of it yet, but
Mhm.
maybe somebody who joins the master's program will solve that crisis. So, but yeah, so I'll leave that there. But I'm happy to talk. Always happy to talk more about data.
Yes. And this is a great segue to the next topic. Okay, so I mean, this is great. This is encouraging. We have lots of data. We're going to have a lot more data coming, the next few years. Satellites are being launched by now dozens a day. Um, so we're proving that, collection pipelines and all that, but how do we actually get from data to decisions, right? So it seems like we largely overcame the data problem. We have some data analysis capacity that it's a bottleneck to some extent, but sounds like machine learning and the help of like small AI models can help with that as well. Um, but the real bottleneck now is converting this like vast amounts of data that we're collecting uh, and um, and the metrics that you mentioned earlier into actionable information, right? So first, I'd like to ask you, Jillian, what does actionable look like? What does it mean from an investor's perspective, and also currently for a conservation organization? And what does success look like for your specific industry? And can you provide some concrete example for how nature data was integrated and led to improved outcomes for people and nature at the same time? So yeah,
Sure.
Julian, you want to
Yeah,
continue
sure. I'll
to
start.
thank you.
Yeah, so as I heard someone say recently, we no longer have a data problem, we have a data science problem. We have to figure out what to do with all this wonderful data that we now have. But despite this plethora of data, turning complex multidimensional nature data into actionable information, sorry, that investors and financial decision makers can use in portfolio and risk management is really the tough thing. That's what we're trying to overcome. So the big question everyone says to us is, okay, so how is this material? how do I put this on my balance sheet? And really until an event takes place, like, the California wildfires and people really see the impact, they tend to be more reactionary.
Mhm.
So they're not proactive. And that goes for a lot of life, and it goes for a lot of the financial world as well.
Mhm.
So because of this, many investors are not quite ready to say, all right, I'm going to take this climate and biodiversity risk metrics and I'm going to make a portfolio decision on it.
Mhm.
And so they're still trying to just like get used to the metrics, understand them. A lot of the people are using them for reporting to, different the TCFD, now the TNFD, um, and the EU SFDR. There's a lot of reporting out there. Most of it's you know currently in Europe, Canada, APAC, less in the US right now. But one thing that we are learning is that even though people are less vocal about their use of these metrics, they're still
Mhm.
asking for it. They still want to use
Yeah.
these metrics. Um, so I think basically the biggest hurdle for me as a data provider is getting investors to go beyond reporting and to
Mm.
really consider these metrics in their financial decision making.
So from here, the incremental
Baby steps. Yeah.
baby steps, but it all goes in the trending in the right direction. So,
Yeah.
Carly.
Yeah, so I think success looks a bit different depending on, the type of projects that we're doing or and the type of stakeholder that we have, right?
Mhm.
So, for, corporate partners, it might be that they're looking to align with the TNFD or these emerging voluntary or involuntary, actual regulations. So things like the EU restoration law, that's right, a strict regulation. So in and there are similar laws, right, that it depends on the country that you're working in. And so there's different sort of compliance and regulatory landscapes depending on where the project is. And so understanding how the data you're getting fits into the metrics that are required for those sorts of reporting is really critical. So making sure we're kind of translating those data to metrics that they can report on. If it's working with governments to, come up with their NBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plans. So that's what they sort of report to the UN. It is, again, what do they need to report on those things? And how can we turn the data into these metrics or indices or indicators that are used? For it could just be something as simple as we need to know if restoration is, I say simple, is restoration working, right? We're working on implementing a regenerative agriculture practice, or we're reforesting an area. Are the
Mhm.
trees growing? Are animals coming back to those trees? How is the carbon stock changing? These are all different aspects of what we'd want to measure to answer the question, is restoration working here? So typically it's different data streams, right? You'll have different data to answer each of those questions, but it's how you then combine those data streams to answer this kind of broad like question or speak to the theory of change that you're trying to implement. So it depends a lot. One example, we do these RAPs or rapid assessment programs where that are particularly used for things like protected area planning. So we'll go into an area with and work with local scientists, with communities on the ground to sort of do like a rapid 2 week blitz to try to capture as much biodiversity in the area to get a sort of biodiversity baseline that we can then track over time. And a lot of those rats have found, species new to science, range extensions for existing species. They've found unique microhabitats, and that is the kind of information that can help spur a new protected area to be formed by the government or and in the terrestrial and the marine space. So a lot of those RAP programs we have, the data we're getting is directly leading to, protected area management, the restoration projects. We're, being informed of, is restoration working here? Do we need to adjust anything? So the how you go from data to sort of actionable information kind of depends on the type of project it is. But
Mhm.
if you can do that, then there are really powerful outcomes possible.
Mhm. All right, thank you. Right, thank you for those examples. And looks like things are different by sector, looks like, and what success can be considered. And obviously, this is all of an evolving field. And just to still come back to the data, which is kind of the topic of tonight. All this framework that have been mentioned here, they're pushing biodiversity into the mainstream, right? And then right, there's a growing risk in what both of you mentioned as like nature risk, trying to understand what's the nature risk. And there's also growing interest in figuring out metrics, like the one metric to rule them all kind of thing, and one method that combines everything: biodiversity impact, dependencies, footprinting, exposure policy. So from a perspective, first of all, like, is it even possible to have such a metric? Especially when we're comparing it to, kind of the carbon and carbon markets where we have CO2 equivalent, right? Let's measure it in many different ecosystems, many different ways. Um, where does it, can there be a metric that rules them all? And then where do some of these metrics that are being used still fall short of the reality on the ground? And maybe Julian can.
Yeah. So I would say that, one of the things one of the things that climate got lucky with, the climate space got lucky with, was CO2 equivalent, right? There was a way to say, here's my emissions, and here's my emissions for carbon, methane, and anything can be changed into how much carbon am I putting into the atmosphere. And it became kind of this golden child because it was one metric and you could use that. But nature is a little bit different than climate. I mean, also climate, we sell so many climate metrics. It's not just one metric. So, but you can track emissions on one metric, but you can't track all climate stuff on one metric. I'm just going to say
Sure.
that. But really, when I started in this field about 8 years ago, biodiversity played second fiddle to climate, and it really was not considered as a financially material risk. And all the data was at the country level. It wasn't granular enough, and there wasn't a lot of insight into biodiversity, and that's really really changed, especially in the last 5 years. And it's in
Mhm.
large part to the TNFD. And a lot of people still ask, where's that CO2 equivalent metric for nature? That's what we really want. So I will say that in the financial service provider world that I live in, we have a lot of clients who say, I still want one metric.
Mhm.
So we do have like a metric that we have in our product called nature risk. And it encompasses so many underlying metrics. And it's interesting because you have some clients who say, I want that one metric, and then you have some who say, I want all the underlying metrics. So
Mhm.
making sure that overarching nature risk metric really encompasses a lot of scientific rigor, and peer-reviewed research, and just making sure that what you're selling is something that you can back up.
Mhm.
I think one of the things that's interesting in the nature space is, people tried to, I mean, they're still trying to kind of create that CO2 equivalent metric for nature. And we saw a lot of movement when nature started coming into the scene. We saw a lot of movement with a footprinting metric.
Hmm.
But really, it hasn't taken hold as the end all be all because a lot of people say like it's not enough. It's not enough to just say, we know our biodiversity footprint. It's also so overly modeled usually a biodiversity footprint, and it
Mhm.
really does not give you like a clear picture. So I think what's being moved towards now is a little bit more assessing nature in the way that we assess physical climate risk, which is kind of why I sit in both of these worlds. But it's really looking at the asset level, like on the ground, what's going on, and understanding not just what's going on in the building that's there, but what's going on around it with the nature and the ecosystems and the water and everything. So,
Yeah, okay, great. Carly, I don't know if you had anything, want to add anything or.
Yeah, just a quick note that I know there
Mhm.
are gr- tons of people working on this. So the Nature Positive Initiative has
Mhm.
a this state of nature metrics where they're trying to kind of coalesce around a basket of metrics that
Mhm.
are sort of used in a semi-standardized way. The it's really kind of a balance of um, being standardized so that it's interoperable across
Mhm.
projects, but also being flexible enough to fit different ecosystems or project types or geographies. So, obviously what works in the marine space is not gonna, work in the mountains. So it's finding that balance and making sure that again you're sort of starting with the problem and working back to
Mhm.
get to what the best kind of metrics or data sets are useful for that problem. There's a lot of different, what's important for one project might be different for another. We work extensively with, indigenous peoples and local communities, and so making sure we're also incorporating local ecological knowledge and their traditional systems to help and building capacity so that they can use different technologies and be able to assess the metrics and the data that helps them best steward their land, right? That's going to look very different from what Jillian's talking about, from what a government may want. And so it really is just kind of making sure that we're starting from the problem and the audience, the kind of key audience, and working back from there to figure out what's best.
Okay. Great. So before going to our last kind of question, trying to end on a high note, I just also want to add that everything is so to what we both said. It's evolving so rapidly. I mean, that we have now the International Standard Organization (ISO) came up with biodiversity standards. They're not quite satisfactory, if you ask me, but it's one of those like small steps that are really in the right direction. Trying to really bring some sort of like defensible, rigor and standardization in a space that's been, really plagued by, very localized metrics. So with that, our closing question here, because I want to circle back to the new program that we're developing as well, but also about to that, climate nature nexus that we started. Um, Kind of looking ahead, right? What are those advances in, foundation models, conservation, policy frameworks, behavior of um, corporations and individuals in this space that really genuinely excites you the most in the next like 3 to 5 years, right? In a way of to continue harnessing the data for better decisions. And then as a kind of corollary to that, what are those critical skills and knowledge that professionals working in this space with nature data and across different sectors should gain or update maybe to be successful in this emerging market? And this was also a question that was just posted on in the Q&A. So welcome your closing thoughts here.
okay. So yeah. So I'll just start by, saying that I joined the financial service at a time when ESG was really booming. And I watched as the financial world embraced ESG and climate, and corporations and banks were setting net zero targets to align with the Paris Agreement. And it was really like a boom. And of course, with recent regulations here in the US, we have seen a shift away from all of that. But I really wanted to, say that like the shift is only a public shift because most companies or our clients are still they still want this data. We're still selling this data, and um, despite what they're announcing publicly or not announcing publicly, institutional investors are still wanting to use these metrics to understand how they are positioned in terms of biodiversity and climate. So that's sort of my like positive note to end with. And yeah, and as Virel said, the metrics, I mean, the data is just, it's the way that we are able to uh, produce metrics and get data is it's changed so monumentally in the last 5 years. And really one of the things that I'm seeing is that data, but when I first started in this space, geospatial data, it was a very niche space. Most people who were doing nature and biodiversity research or who were doing geospatial research associated with this type of science were in government or public service, and the biodiversity related data was coming from research institutions and academia. Everything was low resolution and not updated with regular cadence. So we're really seeing like a full change of that, where now there's all this like publicly available data that you can use commercially, that's updated with regular cadence, that's scientifically rigorous. Remote sensing and satellite data is getting easier to use. AI is making all this data easier to process. And one of the most amazing things is like now we have institutional investors saying like they want location data and
Hmm.
they want biodiversity or climate layers, like they want to put this data into their own models. And that is something that, you know, would have been totally unheard of 20 years ago. So I think we're in a really special place. And I think nature can really become more mainstream. And I hope this program that URL is starting, inspires people to take the classes and learn the things that need to learn to grow in this field. And I would say, you don't have to be um, a PhD scientist. You don't have to be a data scientist. You don't have to come with geospatial knowledge. But I think there's a lot of places you can, there's a lot of spaces in this field. And I'll just quickly, talk about some of the people I work with so you can get a sense. Like I work with a lot of PhDs. I work with a lot of data scientists. I work with a lot of people who are climate sales specialists. So they don't have any background in, data science, or they're, not, they didn't study physics in college, but they are subject matter experts on climate or subject matter experts on biodiversity, and they can come in and they can talk about it. And so it really depends a lot on what you want to do. I will also say that there's a lot of people who their main focus is on the regulatory landscape. So they know all the metrics that are being asked for on the, EU SFDR. They know how to, understand, some of these regulatory frameworks are very intimidating. I hate them personally because I'm like, oh, they're so intimidating. There's so many metrics. But there's people who really that's what they focus on. And they, that's their area of expertise. So there's a lot of things you can do in this field. And yeah.
Okay, thank you, Gillian. Yeah, Carly, last few like some
Yeah.
exciting things and some skills that people should upgrade.
Yeah, I mean, it is an exciting time because of the rapid pace of advances happening in particularly within technology. There's, I would argue, a lot of regulation that needs to catch up to that pace of innovation, to make sure that this, especially Gen AI and things like that, are sort of deployed in responsible and inclusive ways. But it is a really exciting time where we're seeing a lot of new technologies that are enabling us to ask questions we never have thought before. And what I really want to see more is sort of how nature tech can directly unlock nature finance. So, for example, a lot of the work that we're doing and the data we're using is for, like carbon credits or nature credits, or the data for the debt for nature but swap, or a bond, an impact bond, all of these different financial instruments. What are the data sources and the indicators that can directly unlock financing, particularly for folks on the ground? The bottom of the base of the supply chain, the farmer co-ops, the local communities, or small NGOs. Really, how can enabling technologies unlock financing to them? To Jillian's point, there's already been a lot kind of to push nature more into the spotlight, but there's a lot more to be done, and I think we at CI we're thinking a lot about the technology advancements in through the lens of unlocking finance. So I would love to see more kind of done there. Um, that requires everyone, right? It
Mhm.
requires data, people who understand data, people who understand the realities of on the ground field work, right? So our colleagues in the country offices who have intimate knowledge of all the ways that technology can fail. Um, and we need project managers and people who know policy, and like these are all different skill sets that are necessary, and pretty much all of them, regardless of what kind of angle you're entering the conservation space in, use data heavily for that, right? Whether you're working, maybe it's qualitative data because you're working in policy, maybe it's GIS data because you're a spatial analyst. It's regardless of your specific niche within conservation, data is going to be, it will continue to be a fundamental part of that. And so, regardless of, biodiversity data and conservation data is very broad. And so, there's a lot of specific kind of niches that you can carve out for yourself within that. And it will really take everyone. I think this program is incredibly exciting. I wish it existed, many years ago when I was doing grad school, because these types of programs weren't around, and so it was really hard to find a way to get both technical and conservation experience at the same time. And I think this course and it's very kind of this program and it's very practical, hands-on approach is critical to shaping the workforce that we need for the future in conservation. So.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you both so much for your insights and your wisdom and examples. I think we'll have 10 more minutes here to the meeting. We'll turn our attention to some of the questions that were posted in the Q&A box here. Some of them have been answered. We can still add, I see that Jillian wants to answer one particular question live, and
I
um,
I think I might
oh,
have clicked that
oh, where is
accidentally,
it?
but I'm
Okay.
happy to answer any of them live.
Okay, so we do have one question here that it's kind of a recurring question about we mentioned difference in metrics for nature and climate, but is there a way or any sort of conversion metric or way to determine the use of AI or machine learning, which has a negative climate impact versus the positive impact that using these technologies might have on biodiversity and conservation? Um, so just ensure technology is not doing more harm than good. So have any thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, this is one of the things I grapple with regularly, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about because in the climate space, well, first of all, like aside from AI, we're also, using satellite data, and in this day and age, there's so many satellites being sent into orbit. And really, there's a lot of energy that goes into that. So, in the climate space, we use a lot of data that is generated using a lot of energy. So it's in some ways you think, oh, we're just perpetuating the problem, but also um, the data that we now have is so much better than the data we were working with. And it really allows us to have like a better sense of what's going on, and get more granular. And I do think that right now we are seeing a huge AI boom, and data centers are popping up everywhere, and we are seeing sort of a lot of energy and water use in a way that's not sustainable. And I think that that's something we need to focus on alongside how we can use AI to get better insights and find patterns. So it is a little bit of a catch-22, but I think again, great thing for somebody who's interested in this topic to take classes on this program and you know solve the problem. I'm gonna just keep saying that. You guys, everybody should solve all our problems.
Yeah, Carly?
Yeah, it's so there's so much nuance to this. And I really like that I had Mark put or a blog from WRI in this about the juxtaposition of AI's promise and peril for the planet. I think it does a good job of kind of encapsulating all of those nuances. Um, there's a couple of things. So one, the tech companies are not transparent about like the actual usage, water, carbon, energy. And so a lot of the numbers that you see published are sort of guesses. And it's really hard to kind of understand what the actual truth is and then how it's changing over time, because there is a lot of work being done to optimize models. There's sort of a counter move away from large language models now to small language models. So more kind of the premise of like, you don't kill a mosquito with a bazooka, right? You don't need this massive model to answer a small question. So there's a lot of kind of work being done. As we've said, the space moves so rapidly now that we could have very different answers next week, because of how much things are changing. But obviously, we want the companies need to push the companies to be more transparent. And some of them, like Microsoft, just released a sort of constitution-like thing about how they're going to have like a community-centered approach to AI so that they're not pulling water from like communities or increasing people's electricity bills. And so some companies are sort of more open than others about those sorts of initiatives. But it is really, I think, where we sit in the conservation and sustainability space. We are in a crucial place in basically ensuring that AI is used for good and for these situations, because it's going to be used regardless, right? Like every other industry, the ship has already sailed. And so if it's going to be used regardless by everyone else, can we, from our, vantage point in the conservation space, help to ensure that some of it is being used for good, and for impact in our space? So it's a really messy question. There's not a great, easy answer, but yeah, I hope that we get a bit more transparency and that models continue to optimize in the future.
Okay, great. Thank you both. Before going to this next question that we have here, I just want to add to a question earlier from Kim about the technical backgrounds and skills. So Carly mentioned that there's many entry points. Biodiversity data, it's broad, right? So folks with software engineering or data science background, for example, or ML specialists or AI specialists that have never used those kind of tools for ecological and biodiversity data. That is a great point of entry. Like the conservation field as a whole needs high technical expertise, right? But it's not just there. There are many like lower level, just people understanding how populations and ecosystems work and how do you analyze some of that data. Right? So the space is really, really like really broad, and it's valuable to many of this of sectors. Uh, we're almost there, but a couple of quick questions. How do you deal with the accuracy of data collection at at a local level, especially where technology cannot be easily used? So maybe the question here is about maybe not be able to deploy sensors, but rather having to still collect tracks or other types of data.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, it's got like, doing transects or botanical plots or sort of more manual surveys. And really, we often, if we're combining that with different sensors, but it's typically with, again, the communities and landowners from that area who are incredibly knowledgeable about their lands. And so, having them as the resource to be collecting data in really hard to reach locations or things like that, is critical. By no means am I advocating for, there never to be like a human doing field work. That sort of manual ground truthing is, to some extent, is always going to be critical. And there is just immense amounts of knowledge in these communities that we work with. And so just figuring out a way to allow them to digitize what's in their heads to help them support their stewardship.
Okay, thank you. And very quickly, this last question, maybe Jillian can address this quickly about the industry and with all this deregulation in the United States, have different sectors reacted with lowering their interest in biodiversity reporting or nature-based solutions. Can
Yeah,
touch on it a little
so
bit, but
yeah, so
thank
one
you.
thing I'll say here is we uh in the climate space, I haven't even been in it, the financial climate space for that long, but what I've seen is when I first joined, the field, there was a sort of move of transition risk. Everybody was interested in transition risk. And that's really, understanding if we move to a low carbon economy and there's carbon, um, taxes, what would that look like for a company who emits a lot? So transitioning to a low carbon economy would be costly for somebody in the oil and gas industry, maybe not somebody who produces organic food, just to give you like kind of a quick example. Um, but recently, as we have seen regulation move away from this, and we've seen things like the California wildfires, the recent floods in Texas, there's flooding going on right now in the UK. Um, Now we're seeing a shift to more interest in physical climate risk. And I think that's also an interest in nature as well. Um, and part of this is because now the real movement, now what's, the buzzwords we hear is adaptation and resilience. So how are we going to adapt to a changing climate, and how are we going to stay resilient? And some of this is going to become nature-based solutions. And I think that's going to be an expanding market. We do still see a lot of interest in carbon credits. So yeah, that's sort of where the financial world is in terms of climate, and that sort of nature-based solution. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of sort of things in the US right now, but my hope is that it's a phase. And one more thing I'll say on that, and then I know we're over time, so I'll be quiet after that. But yeah, so recently, in late 2025, the International Standards and Boards, I'm getting the name kind of
Mhm.
messed up, but the ISSB is starting to take a more of a leading role on the TNFD. And they took a leading role on the TCFD in, I think, 2024. And so what this really means is that eventually we're going to see a shift towards dual reporting on climate and nature. And if that is something that the mark, that becomes more mainstream, I think it won't matter what the regulations are in the US because I think, once you have institutional investors in Europe and APAC who are, reporting to these frameworks, you're going to get investors in the US doing the same.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts and wisdom, and thank you so much to those of you who listened to our panel, asked very thoughtful questions. If you have any other questions, there's an email address there in the chat. We'll do our best to answer them. With that, I think we're finalizing our panel here. Thank you again. Have a good night, and looking forward to hearing from you again.